Welcome back, Honors! All right, last flip of the Middle Ages, and then we're getting the heck out of this unit, right? Mainly just due to the fact that I don't like it very much, all right? It's not personally my favorite, unless I get to talk about weaponry and the most famous heroine of all of Western civilization, arguably, right? Which I'm going to get to her here in a minute. All right, but let's continue to push forward and keep kind of talking about where we left off in class, right? And we left off in class talking basically about, like, you know, we got to write about, like, the major weapons and their debuts. But as we already know, Philip VI and Edward III are going to start arguing over who gets to be king of France because some other guy named Charles died and he didn't have any sons, and they tried to give it to Edward, but you can't do that because of Salic law. And then Edward's like, I want it, and then Philip says, screw you, and then takes all of his land, and then kapow, and then they end up going to war with each other, right? Yeah. The big thing about this whole war is it does become like a climaxing point of a long-standing rivalry between France and Great Britain, right? Now, you've got a lot of important outcomes of it and things like that, but as we already know, we started talking about this again already, it's going to last 116 years, right? A lot of peace between. There were really only like 9 big battles and a lot of long truces between, right? So mainly because war happens to be so expensive, right? And so they would go into these long truces between because they were running out of money constantly, right? So also not to mention the fact that you kind of got to have a truce around 1347 when the plague hits Europe. That's right, the plague hit Europe during the 100 Years' War, right? So really quickly though, continuing forward. You also have another major important detail about this entire war. Mainly the whole fact of you have the origin of 2 new types of weapons. One was going to be used by the English, and the other one's going to be used by the French later on to much avail, right? So the first one we got to talk about is the one that the English used, right? So the English were very, very famous for using these bad boys, right? The British longbow, right? So the British longbow is a better designed, better designed and much more efficient way of waging war, and a device that only the Brits were really, really good at using, right? So particularly pit men from Welsh, right? Wales. Welsh longbowmen were like the top draw, all right? So like they were super good. Like apparently a part of your Sunday mass goings in England where you would go to mass, and every Sunday after mass you would go and practice your longbow skills, right? So this is what a longbow is, right? A longbow has a much, much bigger, no, the shaft is the arrow. I guess bow. All right, so like the bow is much longer. It's handheld, and it's a device kind of like Robin Hood would use, right? And the point is to bring it up, let go, and then you're having a major arcing shot, and you can land it on things from a great distance away, right? So the Welsh and British longbowmen were like some of the best in the world, right? And they were using this weapon in contrast to the French crossbow, right? Look at this stupid, clunky thing, right? So some of y'all are immediately thinking to yourselves like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, I figured that a crossbow would actually be much more technologically advanced than a longbow. It actually isn't, right? Mainly because, as you can see with this guy's foot and this big crank on the back of it, right? A longbow takes a long time to reload, and it doesn't fire arrows. It fires things called bolts, which are really, really small, right? And they don't go nearly as far, and they're not nearly as accurate, right? So the British longbowmen, with years and years and years of training, were able to deal some major blows to the French using this new device. At one huge battle, actually called the Battle of Agincourt, it was a major, major British victory over a bunch of Frenchmen because the Frenchmen charged the field trying to think like, oh, we'll get in the face of the archers and they won't be able to use their longbows. But then at the Battle of Agincourt, the French guys got stuck in the mud, and the English longbowmen were like, all right, light them up, and they just start raining arrows down on them. So you had men drowning in mud and getting lit up by longbowman arrows as it was going on out of style. And like I said, this crossbow is clunky, and the longbow is just a better device. And then you also had the origin of gunpowder weapons, right? Jot that down. You need to know longbow versus crossbow and gunpowder weapons, right? Gunpowder weapons are going to be debuted following trade negotiations with the Asiatic community, right? So the Chinese had invented gunpowder over like 100 years before this war ever broke out, right? They used it in things like fireworks, and they also used it in the first primitive guns, right? So these new devices are going to eventually make their way to Europe, and this is the first war that they're going to see major use. And your gunpowder weapons include cannons and, of course, the very, very first guns, right? So this right here is a gun, and it's stupid, it's ugly, and dumb, all right? So, anyway, but they're called breech-loading cannons because you would actually load them from the front, right? Now, this is a big cannon itself, and the French are actually going to end up using these things much better towards the end of the war, and they're going to use it to blast English garrisons out of castles completely and end up pushing the war towards their direction, right? So, then you also had a couple other important details, right? So we had major weapons make their debut. Another big important detail is the fact that England was crushing this war for 90% of the time, right? So for most of the war, England was kicking major tuchus, all right? So because if you go back and look at this map real quick that we looked at in class, as you can see, the Greek, okay, look, we'll just do this. All right, so the green is all of England's land holdings, right? So you got England, and then the whole thing starts over this little place called Aquitaine that the English also own, right? And then, of course, Philip tries to take this from them, and then England goes, screw you, and they just go, and they just push all this new land holdings into here, right? And then they lose some of it, but then they end up taking the entire northern region of France, right? So as you can tell, the British were able to actually win a lot of this war early on, right? By using their new weapons, the longbowmen. Also, they had better leaders than the French, right? For example, one man was very, very famous. He was known as Edward the Black Prince, right? He's the son of Edward III, and he was called Edward the Black Prince because he would actually wear black armor, right? So he would actually show up at the battle wearing black armor, and that's why they called him Edward the Black Prince. They had much better leaders, right? And at one point of this war, England was actually ruling over France for about 40 years, right? Because it was considered that they had won, and they were just trying to mind their own business and trying to fight the southern French who was trying to be rebelled up by this guy named Charles, right? So to give you a little bit of backstory, right? Here's the other thing. The last detail that you need to remember, other than England's crushing the war because of better weapons early on and then also better leaders, like Edward the Black Prince, you need to understand this other thing. These alliances are very messy, all right? So, these alliances are crazy messy. I'm not going to draw an entire map, but see this big region up here around Flanders and this thing right here called Burgundy, all right? So, those two groups of people, mainly the Burgundians, all right, like the Burgundy Street in New Orleans, right, named after this region of France, right, the Burgundians didn't ally with the French. They allied with the English, all right, so they allied against their own people. The Burgundians actually chose to fight the crown of France because they felt that they had more money and deserved to be in charge of France, and they thought that they were going to align with England, who they thought was going to win this war, right? So the Burgundians looked at this as an advantage to try and take over the whole of France by allying with the stronger ally, right? They chose to ally with England. The Burgundians actually, so it was part of France and England versus the rest of France, right? So at this point, when the Burgundians actually controlled this entire region of Flanders and the Duchy of Burgundy, and they actually owned, or they were locking down the north of France, the English thought they had won. The English thought they had won the entire shebang. They thought that they won the whole thing because they were like, look, we've got the Burgundians on our side. They have the current king of France in their control. His name was Charles the Mad. He would actually wear a jacket with iron bars in it because he thought he was made of glass because he was mentally insane, right? So they were holding him in the north of France while his son, Charles VII, is living in the south of France as a cast-out prince, right? Well, here's the thing. There was this one person later on, right? Because war might have broken out over this whole thing, and Charles is sitting there in the south of France thinking, how do I get my country back? Because England's crushing this whole war, and the Burgundians are fighting them. And then there's this one moment in the entire war where people are talking about scooping, they're giving people hands as gifts because they were like, I'm going to chop this guy's hand off and give it to you as a present. It's a whole thing, and those people were actually influential advisors to the king. This whole war is crazy because it broke out in 1337 and was fought on and off again until 1453. And to jump ahead, you can put just a star next to the bottom part or the middle part. France is going to win eventually after aligning with Scotland and reconciling with their wealthy region of Burgundy, right? Or the Burgundians, right? The Burgundians finally get told by the French crown, they're like, look, you are French, we are French, we should be aligned together, and if this one woman was able to show you that we can do this, then you should believe in us. And so the French are going to reconcile with the region of Burgundy, and they're going to that they had allied with England originally, and they're going to push England all the way out, right? Also, underneath right here, put one major effect. One major effect of this entire war, though, as well, is it finally set England aside as an island nation separate from the continent. It got them completely out of France's lands. It got them completely uninvolved because, as we know, like when William of Normandy came in and invaded England originally, like some of England was controlled from France, and like they had to speak French at one point. You know what I mean? So eventually, now a big effect of this is the Burgundians the French are going to become a continental country, and the Brits are going to be an island nation that is separate, right? But when I was talking about Charles the Man, Charles the Sixth is his name, Charles the Man, the guy that literally apparently turned on a bunch of his men and tried to kill somebody he thought was trying to kill him because he was paranoid, right? He had a son named Charles VII who was living in the south of France, and they were losing this war terribly, right? And Charles VII thought, I only have one chance at turning the tide of this war. I have to get to the city of Reims in France, where all men that become king are anointed king with the oil of Clovis. Remember Clovis back in the day, right? Father of France. I have to get to this city, and I have to crown myself king, right? But I can't get there because the Burgundians and the English are stopping us. Well, they couldn't get there until a very, very famous, influential figure by the name of Joan of Arc shows up, right? So Joan of Arc shows up and becomes the savior of France. And she is to this day considered the patron saint of France because of her efforts to turn the tide of this war. England was killing it with the allied Burgundians, and they were winning this war. But then, old Joan of Arc shows up, right? So Joan of Arc, let's give her a little backstory. First of all, was not crazy wealthy. She was born to a poorish peasant family. Like they had like some like clout, but it was a very poor village, right? They didn't have a ton. Born a peasant. Never learned how to read and write, ever. She was illiterate for her entire life, right? So, and then around the age of 13, this young girl by the name of Joan, she starts hearing the voices of saints and angels, right? And she turns and she's farming the first time she hears them. And she's helping her father, and she's at the age of 13, and she hears voices. And she looks, and she believes that the voices are coming from the church, right? And for the very first time, she starts to realize that the voices in her head are saints and holy figures trying to communicate with her, right? And so what she does is she turns and decides to dedicate her life to those saints and God. She takes a vow of chastity at the age of 13, right? And she's even such a boss that she actually avoided an arranged marriage by her father at the age of 16, right? So she's going to try and like separate herself from this altogether. But eventually one day, during the 100 Years' War, one of those voices says, you need to go and you have a mission. 2 parts. 1, retake the major French city of Orléans, spelled O-R-L-E-A-N-S, as in Orleans, right? As in why it's called New Orleans, right? So go retake the famous French city of Orléans, and after you do that, take Charles to Reims and have him crowned king and save your country, right? So what she decides to do at the age of 16, she's like, I gotta do this, right? So she cuts her hair and she dresses like a man to avoid it being assaulted on the roads, right? And she walks to a nearby town at one point to try and go get a horse and some supplies. And then the garrison commander's like, no, you can't have any. I don't believe you've heard the voices of anybody, right? So, and then she's like, fine. And she goes back into the city and then comes back again with people that believe her. And eventually the guy relents and gives her a horse and some supplies, right? And then she takes the 11-day journey and finds Prince Charles and living in a castle in southern France, right? And she tries to tell this local judge, that she's heard the voices of God, right? And the voice of God says, I'll go tell the king. And Charles took a leap of faith, right? So he's like, maybe we'll ask her to pass some tests. And to this day, we don't know specifically what Joan did to convince Charles that he had heard, or that she had heard the voices of God and saints. But apparently it was in a private conversation, And then a lot of other people say there was like a famous scene where like she walked into a chapel and he was like the king was sitting on a throne and she was like, "That's not my king, that is," and pointed Charles out amongst a crowd, and he wasn't dressed like a royal at the time. So like there's a lot of stories, but apparently she convinces Charles that she has heard the voices of God, right? So what Joan ends up doing is she is given an army and a horse, right? So Charles VII grants her an army. And the thing is, you got to look at it from Charles' perspective. Like, he's not losing anything in this gamble, right? Like, so he was going to send this army out anyway. So he decides, like, you know what? I'll send her with a couple of priests because she said she's heard the voice of God. I'll give her a new set of armor. I'll give her a big banner to, like, walk out in front. And it'll say Jesus and Mary on it, which it actually does. And, like, you know the famous gold statue in New Orleans of her sitting on her horse and she's got the bannerment right there? That's supposed to be her riding into battle, right? But funny enough, she didn't wear gold armor when she actually went out. She actually apparently wore white armor, right? But ironically enough, it wasn't white. It was just so shined up that it reflected a lot of light, so it like appeared white, right? So, but Joan goes to Orleans and has a huge victory, takes the whole city, right? Especially after these other two commanders were telling her the whole time, it's like, okay, so here's the plan, Joan, you simple little girl. Jerks. Like, literally, we're going to take this barricade, and 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 then we're going to finally take the castle at Orleans, right? And she was like, isn't it going to cost a lot of lives, and, like, a lot of people are going to die in this whole process? And they were like, yeah, your point. And she says, no, I got a better idea. Let's get him! And then she just like wants to lead a full frontal attack, right? So she does. She actually listens to what the generals say at first, and then she eventually leads a massive assault on the castle, right? So, and at one point, ask me to tell you how or why she was really mad, but there was this English commander who yelled some stuff at her from the top of the castle before this whole attack happened, and that guy ends up getting his comeuppance because he ends up trying to run away, when he tries to run away, the bridge that he's running away on collapses and he ends up drowning in the river after he said something very rude to her. And if you ask me in class, I'll tell you what he said to her. Now, anyway, so after taking the major city of Orleans, she is now checked off one thing on her God to-do list, right? And she leads Charles to Reims, where he is crowned king and he is anointed with the oil of Clovis, and he is now proclaimed the king of France, right? In the face of England, who was like, that's not the king of France. The king of France is this English guy that we actually thought that he would do it. Named Henry, all right? So, but this is very, very insulting. And so Charles is like, thank you, Joan. I appreciate it. You're awesome. Now go back home. And so she was like, whoa. I just retook Orleans. I took an arrow to the shoulder, ripped it out, and then kept fighting and threw ladders up against the wall of this castle and took that bad boy down for you. And now you're going to send me home? And so he says, okay, fine. I'll send you out outside of Paris. You can try and retake that city. Good luck. And so go do your thing. So she goes into an English encampment trying to take all their supplies out and destroy them while they like slept. But apparently it was like a big trap. And the Burgundians actually captured her and actually sold her to the British, right? They sold her over to the British. So the French people captured Joan and then sold her to the Brits, right? So the English are going to put her on trial in front of the Inquisition. Make sure you know that. The Inquisition, they're going to put her on trial for 70 different charges, right? Mainly, they're just trying to insult this person because they feel as though she's like the guiding light of the entire war, right? Because, like, remember, England's been winning this entire time until this lady showed up, right? So, and her raids are actually going to be the tidal turn for the French, right? And so the English put her on trial for 70 different things, including witchcraft, heresy, and the big one at the very, very end is cross-dressing, right? So they actually put her on trial for cross-dressing, and they hold her inside of a big cell, and at one point, she is being held captive, right? And then the Catholic priest that's leading this Inquisition is trying to convince her to say she never heard the voices of God and saints, right? And actually, she was told after being held captive for a year that if you can live, if you sign a document saying you never heard them, and the only reason she signed it. She did sign it. She said, I've never heard the voice of God. And the only reason she did that is because she was standing on a scaffold next to a man with an axe that was about to cut off her head. And so out of fear, she said, I have never heard the voices of God, right? And so she put on women's clothes, and the Pope said, or the priest said, you are allowed to live in captivity, but you are never going to be a free person ever again. But then he leaves and then comes back, and a couple of days after that, she's cross-dressing again. She puts on the men's clothes again to try and avoid assault, apparently, from the the guards, and then she was told not to do this. And since she has betrayed the agreement that she signed, saying she would not cross-dress, witchcraft, heresy, any of those things ever again, she gets burned at the stake at the age of 19. Right? Now, according to a lot of stuff, they say that a man in the crowd held a cross up for her so she would never apparently feel pain during the entire process, which actually can be seen here, that he apparently held that up for her to look at, and that she never screamed or cried aloud, but she was burnt at the stake for cross-dressing a second time, right? But 25 years later, they lead a second inquisition that vindicates her, saying that she did hear the voices of God, but that one's actually, of course, held in France. But then in 1920, Pope Benedict XV actually canonizes her as the patron saint of all of France. And remember, France was losing battle after battle after battle after battle after battle until in the 100 Years' War, until she showed up, right? So in the long run, France ends up winning and separates England away. But of course, this is just another thing of the late Middle Ages, a big fat crisis. We'll talk about this more tomorrow. I can't wait to see you all. Bye.